It's a bustling Saturday afternoon at the Duotour Cafe in East Tokyo, and the familiar sounds of a language exchange fill the air. The careful pronunciation of English words, the patient corrections of grammar, and the gentle laughter of students and teachers working together. Among the tables sits a young British woman with blonde hair, teaching materials spread before her, helping a Japanese man practice his conversation skills. To any observer, it's a perfectly normal scene, the kind that happens thousands of times every day across Tokyo's countless cafes. What those observers don't know is that they're witnessing the final hour of Lindsay Hawker's life. And the man sitting across from her isn't really a student at all. He's a predator who has spent months planning this exact moment, crafting an elaborate deception that will end in one of Japan's most disturbing murder cases. But to understand how this ordinary Saturday became a nightmare, we need to rewind the clock and examine the two very different paths that led these two people to this cafe. Our story begins in the English Midlands, in the historic city of Coventry. It's December 30th, 1984, and Lindsay Ann Hawker has just been born to Bill and Julia Hawker. Growing up alongside her two sisters, Louise and Lisa, Lindsay quickly establishes herself as the kind of child every parent hopes for: bright, curious, and endlessly optimistic about the world around her. At King Henry VIII School, Lindsay excelled academically while maintaining the kind of warm personality that drew people to her. Teachers described her as nurturing and caring, always ready to help classmates who were struggling. It was a trait that would define her throughout her life, and ultimately tragically contribute to her death. When it came time for university, Lindsay chose to study biology at the University of Leeds. She approached her studies with characteristic determination, achieving first-class honours in 2006. But Lindsay wasn't just focused on academics. She had built a life filled with friends, family, and a serious relationship with her boyfriend of several years. As graduation approached in 2006, Lindsay found herself at a crossroads. She could immediately pursue a master's degree or take a year to explore the world and gain new perspectives. The choice wasn't difficult for someone with Lindsay's adventurous spirit. She decided to go to Japan to teach English. In October 2006, Lindsay signed up with Nova, Japan's largest private English school. Nova was considered the gold standard for English teaching positions in Japan, and competition for spots was fierce. The fact that Lindsay secured a position spoke to both her qualifications and her natural teaching ability. When Lindsay's plane touched down at Narita Airport in October 2006, she was stepping into a world unlike anything she'd experienced before. Tokyo was a city of contradictions, ancient traditions existing alongside cutting-edge technology, quiet temple gardens nestled between towering skyscrapers. Lindsay was initially assigned to teach in Koiwa, a district in the Edogawa ward of Tokyo. It was a perfect location, close enough to the city centre to enjoy Tokyo's incredible nightlife and cultural offerings, but far enough out to experience authentic Japanese residential life. To make her budget stretch further, Lindsay moved to Chiba Prefecture, where she found two other English teachers to share an apartment with. These roommates quickly became close friends, providing the support network that every expat needs when living far from home. Lindsay's work at Nova was going exceptionally well. Her supervisors praised her dedication and natural teaching ability. Her students appreciated her patience and enthusiasm, and her classes were consistently popular. Despite being thousands of miles from home, Lindsay maintained close contact with her family and friends in England. In one particularly telling message to her sisters, Lindsay wrote about how safe she felt in Tokyo. Coming from England, where crime rates were higher, she was amazed by how secure Japanese society felt. It was this sense of safety, this trust in the fundamental goodness of people, that would ultimately make her vulnerable to a predator who was already watching her every move. While Lindsay was building her new life in Tokyo, just 30 kilometers away in Ichikawa, another story was unfolding, one that would intersect with Lindsay's in the most horrific way possible. Tatsuya Ichihashi was born on January 5th, 1979, in Gifu Prefecture, the son of two highly successful medical professionals. His father was a respected brain surgeon, his mother a dentist, and they had built a comfortable upper-middle-class life for their family. From the outside, Tatsuya seemed to have every advantage: wealth, education, and family support. But appearances can be deceiving. Tatsuya had initially pursued medical studies with the goal of becoming a doctor like his father. But when he failed his medical school entrance exams, he was forced to settle for a degree in horticulture from Chiba University, which he completed in 2005. Rather than pursuing work in horticulture or any other field, Tatsuya chose to live off an allowance from his parents, approximately 100,000 yen, about $920 per month. It represented a complete lack of ambition or direction. Those who knew Tatsuya during this period described him using a term that has particular significance in Japanese culture, hikikomori. This refers to people who withdraw from social life and become reclusive, often staying in their homes for months or years at a time. Tatsuya's isolation wasn't complete, however. He maintained an obsessive focus on physical fitness, spending hours each day at the gym and cycling up to 25 kilometers daily. This wasn't healthy pursuit of wellness. It was compulsive behavior that seemed to be his only outlet for the frustration and anger building inside him. More troubling were the signs of violent behavior that had already begun to emerge. Tatsuya had allegedly assaulted a woman during a robbery attempt, though the matter had been settled out of court with his father reportedly paying the victim around 1 million yen. He had also received formal warnings for stalking behavior during his university years. These weren't isolated incidents. They were warning signs of a pattern of predatory behavior that was escalating. But because they had been handled quietly, with family money covering up the legal consequences, Tatsuya never faced the kind of intervention that might have prevented what was to come. By 2007, those close to Tatsuya reported that his mental state was deteriorating further. He spoke about feeling unstable and losing control, but there's no evidence that he sought professional help. Instead, Tatsuya began developing a new obsession, one that would prove fatal for Lindsay Hawker. According to the police investigation that would later reconstruct the timeline, Tatsuya had been watching Lindsay for months before he worked up the courage to approach her. This wasn't a chance encounter or a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a carefully planned campaign of surveillance and preparation. Tatsuya had noticed the Nova Language School logo on Lindsay's distinctive tote bag during her daily commute. He used this information to craft an elaborate deception, positioning himself as someone desperate to improve his English for academic purposes. He studied her routines, learned her schedule, and waited for the perfect moment to make his move. The level of premeditation involved was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a methodical plan executed by someone who had been fantasizing about controlling and harming Lindsay for an extended period. Think about what this means. While Lindsay was going about her daily life, teaching her classes, exploring Tokyo, staying in touch with family and friends, she had no idea that someone was watching her every move, learning her patterns, and planning to destroy her life. For Tatsuya, the English lesson request was the perfect cover story. It played into Lindsay's natural desire to help others while providing him with a plausible reason to spend time alone with her. He probably spent weeks or even months refining this approach, waiting for the right opportunity to put his plan into action. It was a typical evening in March 2007, when Lindsay finished her shift at Nova and headed home to Chiba. She had stopped at a local bar called Hippy Dippy Doo with some fellow teachers, a common way for expats to unwind and maintain their connections to Western culture while living in Japan. The journey home was routine. Catch the train from Tokyo back to Chiba, retrieve her bicycle from the station, and ride the familiar route to her apartment. It was a trip she had made hundreds of times, always feeling safe and secure. But tonight was different. As Lindsay was unlocking her bicycle at Chiba Station, she was approached by a man she didn't recognize. He was several years older than her, physically fit, and spoke to her in English with a confident familiarity that immediately put her on guard. "You are my English teacher," he said, as if stating a simple fact. Lindsay knew all of her students at Nova, and this man was definitely not one of them. She politely corrected him, explaining that he was mistaken, but Tatsuya persisted. He began asking her personal questions. Where was she from? Where had she studied? How long had she been in Japan? As Lindsay tried to end the conversation and leave, she realized that the stranger was following her. What started as walking behind her bicycle became jogging, then running, as she tried to increase her speed to get away from him. The narrow streets and intersecting walkways of suburban Chiba made it impossible to simply outrun him. When Lindsay finally reached her apartment building, she was faced with a dilemma. She could try to get inside quickly and hope he would leave, but that would also reveal exactly where she lived. She could continue riding and try to lose him, but she was already tired, and he seemed determined to keep following her. It was at this moment that Tatsuya made his pitch. Despite the bizarre circumstances of chasing her through the streets, he claimed that his intentions were innocent. He said he was a student who desperately needed help improving his English for his studies abroad. he was willing to pay generously for private lessons, 3,500 yen, about $32 per hour. But first, he said, he was exhausted from running and desperately needed a drink of water. This request put Lindsay in an impossible position. Her natural kindness and desire to help people was being weaponized against her by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate those instincts. Refusing to give water to someone who claimed to be thirsty would go against everything Lindsay believed about treating others with compassion. After a moment of hesitation, Lindsay made the decision that would seal her fate. She invited Tatsuya into her apartment. Inside Lindsay's apartment, with her two roommates present, Tatsuya continued his performance. He was charming, articulate, and seemed genuinely grateful for Lindsay's kindness. He accepted the glass of water and made polite conversation, gradually putting everyone at ease. It was during this visit that Tatsuya produced a pen and piece of paper and sketched a portrait of Lindsay. The drawing was actually quite good, demonstrating genuine artistic talent. He signed it with his name, Tatsuya Ichihashi, along with his phone number and email address. This sketch would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the police investigation, but at the time it seemed like a harmless gesture from an eccentric but essentially innocent person. Tatsuya renewed his request for English lessons, this time offering specific terms, 3,500 yen per hour for conversation practice in a public cafe. For Lindsay, who was living on a teacher's salary and trying to save money, it was an attractive offer. Lindsay's roommates would later tell police that they had warned her against meeting this stranger again. Something about the encounter felt off to them. Perhaps it was the way he had followed her home, or maybe it was simply intuition telling them that his behaviour wasn't normal. But Lindsay, ever the optimist and natural helper, couldn't see any harm in helping someone improve their English in a public place. Teaching was her profession and her passion, and this seemed like a straightforward business transaction. She agreed to meet Tatsuya at a cafe in a few days for their first lesson. The Duo Tour Cafe was exactly the kind of place where language exchanges typically took place. Bright, casual, and filled with the chatter of people from different cultures learning from each other. When Lindsay arrived on March 24, 2007, she probably felt confident about the arrangement. Security cameras captured the entire encounter, providing investigators with a frame-by-frame record of Lindsay's final hour. The footage shows a young woman who appears professional but slightly uncomfortable, repeatedly pushing her hair aside, a nervous habit that her family would later recognize. For approximately 50 minutes, Lindsay attempted to conduct a normal English lesson. She had brought teaching materials and was clearly making an effort to provide value for the generous hourly rate Tatsuya was paying. But the security cameras also captured something else, the elaborate deception that Tatsuya had prepared for this moment. When it came time to pay for the lesson, Tatsuya began an exaggerated performance of searching through his pockets and bag. He pantomimed surprise and embarrassment as he claimed to have forgotten to bring the money to pay Lindsay. It was a carefully rehearsed act designed to create the perfect pretext for getting Lindsay alone. The solution he proposed seemed reasonable. His apartment was only a 5-minute taxi ride away. They could go there quickly, he would get the money, and Lindsay could be on her way. At 10 a.m, the security cameras show Lindsay and Tatsuya leaving the cafe together and getting into a taxi. Lindsay appears calm and unsuspecting as they head toward what she believes will be a quick stop to collect her payment. She has no way of knowing that Tatsuya has been planning this moment for months, or that his apartment has been prepared specifically for what he intends to do to her. Tatsuya's apartment in Ichikawa was a reflection of his isolated and obsessive lifestyle. The 3-bedroom space was sparsely furnished but filled with fitness equipment and violent manga. More ominously, it was located in a building where neighbours kept to themselves and noise complaints were rare. When the taxi arrived at the apartment building, Lindsay made what seemed like a sensible precaution. She asked the driver to wait for her while she went inside to collect the money. 7 minutes passed with no sign of Lindsay. The taxi driver, probably assuming that his passengers had decided to settle the fare inside or had simply forgotten about him, drove away. He would later become a crucial witness in the investigation, the last person other than her killer to see Lindsay Hawker alive. What happened inside that apartment during the following hours represents one of the most brutal and disturbing crimes in recent Japanese history. Based on the forensic evidence that police would later discover, Lindsay fought for her life with incredible courage and determination. The crime scene that investigators would later process painted a picture of prolonged suffering. Lindsay had been bound with gardening ties and gagged with scarves. The bruising pattern on her body indicated that she had been beaten repeatedly and violently. The damage to her neck showed that she had been strangled with such force that the cartilage was broken. In a final act of degradation and control, Tatsuya had shaved all of Lindsay's hair from her head and placed it in a plastic bag. Investigators believe this was part of his attempt to dehumanize his victim and assert complete dominance over her. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the crime was what Tatsuya did after Lindsay was dead. Rather than panicking or immediately fleeing after committing murder, Tatsuya embarked on a methodical plan that revealed the true depth of his psychological disturbance. He had apparently thought through not just how to kill Lindsay, but how to dispose of her body in a way that would allow him to keep her close while avoiding detection. Tatsuya's plan was as grotesque as it was calculated. He dragged a large detachable bathtub from his bathroom onto the apartment's balcony, a task that required considerable physical effort and created the heavy scraping sounds that neighbours later reported hearing. He filled the bathtub with a mixture of sand, soil, and what investigators believe was a decomposing agent designed to accelerate the breakdown of organic matter. Lindsay's naked body was placed in this makeshift grave and covered with the mixture. But Tatsuya wasn't finished. His plan was to create what appeared to be a large planter on his balcony, complete with flowers planted on top of Lindsay's remains. He had flower seeds ready to plant, which would have fed on Lindsay's decomposing body as they grew. The psychological implications of this plan are almost too disturbing to contemplate. Tatsuya intended to create a living memorial to his crime, a garden that he could tend and admire while knowing that it contained the remains of his victim. If Tatsuya had been given just a few more hours to complete his work, Lindsay might never have been found. She would have simply disappeared, leaving her family and friends to wonder forever what had happened to the bright young teacher who had vanished in Tokyo. By March 26th, Lindsay's disappearance had been noticed by multiple people. Her roommates were worried when she failed to return home, and her employers at Nova were alarmed when she missed work, completely out of character for someone as reliable as Lindsay. When Nova contacted Lindsay's parents in England, the investigation finally began in earnest. Lindsay's roommates provided crucial information about the strange man who had followed her home and sketched her picture. They still had the sketch with Tatsuya's name, phone number and email address, evidence that quickly led investigators to their prime suspect. By 5:40 p.m. on March 26th, 2 officers had located Tatsuya's apartment building in Ichikawa. Under Japanese law, they couldn't simply force entry without proper cause, so they waited outside while calling for backup. As more officers arrived, they noticed something unusual. Tatsuya's detachable bathtub had been moved to the balcony. By 8 p.m., 9 officers had assembled around the building. At exactly 10 p.m., Tatsuya suddenly burst out of his apartment carrying a rucksack. He was barefoot and moving with desperate energy. What followed was a chase scene that seemed more like an action movie than real police work. Tatsuya headed straight for the building's fire escape, demonstrating the athletic ability that came from his obsessive fitness routine. He vaulted over the last section of the stairway, landing on the ground and immediately sprinting into the street. The pursuing officers, weighed down by their gear, couldn't match Tatsuya's speed. He evaded capture by zigzagging through the narrow streets of Ichikawa. Using his knowledge of the local area to stay ahead of his pursuers, in a matter of minutes, one of Japan's most wanted criminals had simply vanished into the night. It would be the closest that law enforcement would get to catching Tatsuya Ichihashi for more than 2.5 years. While Tatsuya was disappearing into the Tokyo night, the officers who remained at his apartment were about to make a discovery that would shock even experienced homicide investigators. The apartment showed obvious signs of a violent struggle. Lindsay's belongings were scattered throughout the rooms, and there were clear indications that a brutal assault had taken place inside. But it was the balcony that revealed the true horror. The large bathtub was positioned prominently on the balcony, filled with sand and soil. A small white hand protruding from the surface immediately caught the investigators' attention. As they carefully excavated the contents of the makeshift grave, the full scope of Tatsuya's depravity became clear. Lindsay's body had been placed in the tub and covered with the soil mixture, along with flower seeds that were meant to grow from her remains. At 3 a.m. on March 27th, Bill and Julia Hawker received the phone call that no parent should ever have to receive. A body had been found, and they needed to come to Tokyo to identify their daughter's remains. Within hours of discovering Lindsay's body, Tokyo Metropolitan Police launched one of the most extensive manhunts in the city's recent history. Tatsuya's photograph was distributed on 100,000 wanted posters throughout Japan, making him one of the most recognizable faces in the country. But despite this massive effort, Tatsuya seemed to have vanished completely. Police investigated over 8,000 reported sightings and assigned 140 officers to the case full-time, but they were no closer to finding their suspect. What no one knew at the time was that Tatsuya was actively transforming himself into someone completely unrecognizable. According to the memoir that Tatsuya would later publish, his life as a fugitive was a nightmare of constant fear and self-mutilation. He initially survived by hiding among the homeless population, but as his face became increasingly recognizable, he realized that more drastic measures would be necessary. Using a box cutter and scissors, Tatsuya began systematically mutilating his own face. He sliced off the prominent moles on his left cheek that had been featured prominently in wanted posters. He cut parts of his lower lip to change its shape. He used thread and needles to bind his nose in an attempt to alter its appearance. The pain was excruciating, and his first attempts often failed when he couldn't push through the agony. But his desperation to avoid capture drove him to complete each grotesque self-surgery. While his face healed from these crude procedures, Tatsuya wore multiple surgical masks and avoided public places. But he knew that his amateur attempts at facial reconstruction could only do so much. If he wanted to truly disappear, he would need professional help. Using forged identity documents, Tatsuya took a job at a construction company in Osaka under a false name. For 13 months, he lived a carefully controlled existence in the company dormitory, working long hours and saving every yen he could earn. His colleagues later described him as an odd antisocial figure who kept to himself and never removed his cap or glasses in public. "We gossiped that he was an odd guy, but I never thought he was the suspect," one former colleague told reporters after Tatsuya's eventual capture. Over 13 months of construction work, he managed to save approximately 1 million yen, enough to pay for professional cosmetic surgery that would complete his transformation. With his savings, Tatsuya underwent 2 separate cosmetic surgery procedures, one to create a longer and narrower nose, and another to raise the bridge of his nose. At both clinics, he provided false names and addresses and failed to return for follow-up appointments. The surgeries were successful in dramatically altering his appearance. Combined with his earlier self-mutilation, Tatsuya now looked significantly different from the man whose face had been plastered on wanted posters throughout Japan. But Tatsuya's perfectionism would ultimately prove to be his downfall. In October 2009, not satisfied with his previous transformations, he decided to undergo one final procedure to alter the shape of his mouth. He visited a clinic in Nagoya, confident that his new appearance would protect him from recognition. The procedure itself went smoothly, but the medical staff were intrigued by something they noticed during the consultation: strange, crude scars on Tatsuya's left cheek where he had removed his moles with a box cutter. The scars were unlike anything the professional medical staff had seen before. They were clearly not the result of professional surgery, but rather the work of someone who had mutilated themselves with crude tools. Suspicious about why someone would inflict such damage on themselves, the clinic staff reported the visit to police and provided multiple photographs of their unusual patient. When investigators examined the photos, they immediately recognized Tatsuya despite his altered appearance. On November 4, 2009, police released the new images to the press, revealing for the first time that the fugitive had undergone extensive plastic surgery. When Tatsuya saw his new image broadcast on television news, he knew his 2.5-year run was coming to an end. He immediately purchased a disguise kit and headed to the ferry terminal in Osaka, planning to escape to Okinawa. But on November 10, 2009, just moments before his ferry was scheduled to depart, a port worker's attention was drawn to a tall, suspicious-looking man wearing sunglasses and a surgical mask despite being indoors. Despite all his surgeries, disguises, and careful planning, there was something about Tatsuya that still seemed familiar. The worker contacted security, who immediately called police. Within minutes, officers arrived at the ferry terminal and approached the suspicious passenger. When they asked for identification, Tatsuya knew that his incredible run as a fugitive was finally over. "Yes," he told them, "I am Tatsuya Ichihashi." The arrest brought enormous relief to Lindsay's family and to law enforcement agencies that had been embarrassed by their inability to capture the fugitive. During his trial, Tatsuya admitted to raping and murdering Lindsay, but claimed that her death was accidental. a claim that no evidence supported. On July 21, 2011, the Chiba District Court sentenced Tatsuya Ichihashi to life imprisonment. While Lindsay's family had hoped for the death penalty, the court determined that his age and lack of prior convictions made rehabilitation theoretically possible. In a final act of narcissism, Tatsuya published a best-selling memoir about his time as a fugitive, focusing on his own suffering while completely ignoring the horror he had inflicted on Lindsay and her family. The case remains one of Japan's most notorious murder cases, not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the extraordinary lengths the killer went to in order to avoid capture. It exposed the vulnerability of even the most safety-conscious individuals to predators who are willing to exploit basic human kindness. Lindsay Hawker was a young woman whose greatest strength, her desire to help others learn and grow, was turned against her by a monster who saw her compassion as weakness to be exploited. Her death serves as a tragic reminder that evil can wear a friendly face, and that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those who seem to need our help the most. Today, Lindsay would have been in her late 30s, possibly with a family of her own and a successful career built on her love of teaching. Instead, she remains forever 22 in the memories of those who loved her, a bright light extinguished by someone who chose to embrace darkness rather than seek the help he desperately needed. The stranger who asked for English lessons got exactly what he wanted, but justice, though delayed, eventually found him too.